Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're focusing on one of the most, compelling stories in modern genetics, the journey to understand Huntington disease.
Or HD, as we'll call it.
Right, HD. And we're looking at it not just as this devastating illness, but really as a perfect blueprint, a paradigm for how we can study these incredibly complex neurodegenerative disorders.
Yeah.
Our mission is to trace this journey really step by step, from just observing a strange familial disease back in the 19th century, all the way to modern gene editing.
And it's a fantastic story of what we call reverse genetics.
Which means,
It means finding a gene's location, its physical spot on a chromosome, without knowing anything at all about the protein it makes. You're working backwards.
so why is HD such a good model for this?
Well, its genetics are just so definitive. It's an autosomal dominant disorder. It's monogenic.
Meaning just one gene is responsible?
Exactly, a mutation in a single gene. And, the critical part is that it is 100% penetrant.
If you have the mutation, you will get the disease. There's no ambiguity.
None. And clinically, it presents as this adult-onset progressive disease with behavioral changes, the signature uncontrolled movements we call chorea, and then a really severe cognitive decline. Over the last few decades, basically every major advancement in molecular genetics has been tested and validated on HD. It's really guided our approach to other diseases, like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's.
So let's start at the beginning of that story. The first real clinical description comes from George Huntington way back in 1872. But the modern effort, the real push, was fueled by just incredible human grit. I'm thinking of the Hereditary Disease Foundation and especially the work of Nancy Wexler.
Oh, absolutely.
Wexler organized these, they were legendary expeditions to Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela.
Right, to study that one enormous family.
A pedigree of 18,000 people. It's just staggering.
Oh.
So why there? Why Venezuela?
Because that massive population gave them the statistical power they needed to map the gene. They collected thousands of samples, creating all these cell lines that had the DNA they were looking for.
And the key technology to analyze that DNA was something proposed around 1980 by Botstein, White, and Davis.
Right. Restriction fragment length polymorphisms.
Or RFLPs. It sounds complex.
It does, but the idea behind it was, well, brilliantly simple. You have these things called restriction enzymes that cut DNA at very specific sequences. But if there's a mutation, a polymorphism, in that sequence, the enzyme can't cut.
So the resulting DNA fragments are different lengths.
Precisely. And you could visualize these different sized fragments, the RFLPs, and use them as physical markers.
Like signposts.
Exactly. Signpost all along the chromosomes. This whole approach, positional cloning, was about finding the gene's address using these signposts, all without knowing a thing about the Huntington protein itself.
And the breakthrough came from James Gusella's team using that Venezuelan pedigree and a specific marker they called G8. What did they find?
Just overwhelming evidence of linkage. The disease gene was almost always inherited along with a very specific DNA pattern from that G8 marker.
The linkage was that strong.
Oh, incredibly strong. It gave them near certainty about the location. It proved the HD gene was physically right next to the G8 site.
So once they had the signpost, how did they pin down the exact address, the chromosome?
They used something called somatic cell hybrids. Basically, human cells fused with mouse cells. This allowed them to figure out which human chromosome that G8 marker, which they renamed D4S10, was actually on. And the results, published in 1983, were clear. The HD gene was on the tip of the short arm of human chromosome 4.
And that wasn't just about finding one gene, was it?
Not at all. It launched the entire field of positional cloning. It was the first time an RFLP marker had ever been used to map a human autosomal disease.
Yeah.
It was proof that this whole idea, it actually worked.
But that was just the start. Finding the marker was monumental, but getting from that spot-on chromosome 4 to the actual gene, that took another 10 years.
A huge collaborative effort. The Huntington's Disease Collaborative Research Group. 58 scientists.
And then in 1993, they finally nailed it. The gene IT15, which we now know as HTT.
And this is where we get to the core mechanism, what makes HD so unique. It turns out HD is one of about 14 known trinucleotide repeat disorders.
Meaning, what exactly?
The HTT gene has a repeating sequence of 3 DNA letters, CAG near its beginning. In a normal, healthy allele, you might have, say, 11 to 34 of these CAG repeats.
Okay.
But in the mutant alleles that cause HD, that number is much, much longer, usually 42 to 66 repeats, sometimes even more.
And CAG codes for an amino acid, glutamine.
Right. So this long repeat of CAGs creates a long tail of glutamines, a poly-Q tail, in the final Huntington protein.
And that long tail is the whole problem. It's not that the protein stops working. It's that this new, longer version is actively harmful.
Precisely. We call that a gain-of-function mutation. The mutant Huntington protein, or mHTT, gains a new toxic property. The damage isn't from losing the normal protein, it's from the active toxicity of this mutant one.
And the length of that repeat really dictates everything. I mean, for you listening, the risk categories based on that CAG count are incredibly stark.
They really are.
Under 26 repeats, you're fine. Normal. If you're in the 27 to 35 range, that's intermediate. You won't get HD, but there's a risk for your children.
But once you hit 40 or more repeats,
The diagnosis is certain you will get HD.
and because of that 100% penetrance, that certainty, this knowledge carries an enormous ethical weight.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, the guidelines for pre-symptomatic testing are incredibly rigorous. You need extensive genetic counseling both before and after. And we typically defer testing for children until they're adults unless there are symptoms of juvenile HD. The psychological impact, it's profound.
Okay, so let's unpack this toxicity. This mHTT protein is everywhere. The nucleus, the cytoplasm, the synapses. How does one faulty protein cause so much chaos?
Well, that expanded polyQ region makes the mHTT protein misfold and get sticky. These misfolded proteins then aggregate. They form clumps.
And the clumps are the problem.
The clumps are toxic because they bind to and essentially kidnap other crucial molecules the cell needs to function. It's like a widespread seizure of the cell's essential machinery.
Can you walk us through some of the biggest malfunctions? Let's start in the nucleus, the cell's control center.
Sure. In the nucleus, we see what's called transcriptional disruption. The mHTT protein physically blocks essential enzymes, particularly histone acetyltransferases, or HATs.
And HATs are what normally loosen up the DNA so genes can be read.
Exactly. So when they're blocked, you get what's called histone hypoacetylation, which locks down the DNA. It forms heterochromatin.
It's like a librarian coming in and just super gluing half the books on the shelves shut. The cell can't read the instructions it needs to live.
That's a great analogy. And it leads to the shutdown of critical genes, including the one for BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which nerve cells are desperate for.
And what's happening out in the cytoplasm?
Out there, we have impaired protein folding and degradation. The aggregates just overwhelm the cell's quality control systems. Chaperone proteins, which are supposed to help other proteins fold correctly, get inactivated.
So things aren't being built right.
And they're not being thrown out right either. The cell's garbage disposal, the proteasome system, which tags bad proteins with ubiquitin for destruction. It gets clogged and inhibited by these mHTT clumps.
So you have too many bad proteins being made, and the garbage disposal is jammed. That's a catastrophe.
It is. And specifically in the nervous system, we see very early synaptic dysfunction, sometimes decades before the neurons actually die.
How so?
Studies in fruit fly models, Drosophila, showed that the little vesicles that carry neurotransmitters were smaller than normal. The aggregates disrupt key transport proteins, like one called RAB11, that are essential for moving those vesicles where they need to go.
Wow. And finally, what about the cell's power source?
The mitochondria. Their function is severely impaired. mHTT actually binds to the outer mitochondrial membrane, which damages the electron transport chains.
Which means less energy, less ATP.
Way less ATP. And on top of that, the clumps of mHTT physically block the mitochondria from moving along the microtubules. So the synapses are literally starved of the energy they need to send signals.
Given all that complexity, researchers just desperately needed a way to model this and test potential treatments.
Which is where animal models, especially mice, became so important. We share about 90% of our genes with them.
And what were the big findings from those models?
Well, two were genuinely groundbreaking. First, they made transgenic mice with different CAG repeat lengths, 48 or 89 repeats. And they confirmed the pathology in mice perfectly mirrored humans. You saw clear degeneration in the striatum, and it was directly linked to the repeat length.
Okay, so the model worked. What was the second finding?
The second one, it changed the therapeutic landscape overnight. Researchers engineered mice where they could turn the mutant HTT gene expression on or off. It was inducible.
They could flip a switch.
Essentially, yes, using the antibiotic doxycycline. And here's the amazing part. They let the mice develop clear motor symptoms,
Sure.
and then they switched the mutant gene off.
They turned it off after the mice were already sick. What happened?
The protein aggregates vanished
Right.
rapidly. And the abnormal motor symptoms,
Yeah.
they reversed.
They reversed. The mice got better.
They got better. It was monumental. It was irrefutable proof that treating HD, even in symptomatic stages, could be effective. It offered this massive hope that the damage might not be permanent if you can just remove the toxic source.
That must have just supercharged the search for therapies.
It absolutely did. It's now this huge multi-pronged effort. You have things like cell therapy, for instance. We know HD patients lose BDNF, so some are using modified stem cells to deliver BDNF directly into the brain.
And what about traditional drugs?
There are massive drug screening campaigns looking for compounds that can stimulate those helpful chaperone proteins to try and refold the mHTT into a less harmful shape, or even stop it from clumping together in the first place.
But if the problem is the toxic protein, the most direct solution, like in that mouse study, has to be stopping it from ever being made.
Which brings us to gene silencing.
Right. And one of the main methods is something called antisense oligonucleotides, or ASOs. How do they work?
ASOs are short, synthetic, single strands of DNA. They're designed to be a perfect match for the toxic mHTT messenger RNA.
So they bind to it.
They bind to it,
Yeah.
forming this DNA-RNA hybrid. And that hybrid structure attracts an enzyme called RNase H, which sees it, comes in, and just destroys the toxic mRNA.
Before it can be translated into the harmful protein.
Exactly. You intercept the bad message before it can ever be read. Clinical trials are already underway, infusing the drug into the cerebrospinal fluid.
What about other methods like the zinc-finger nucleases, ZFNs?
The ZFNs work a bit earlier at the DNA level. They're engineered to bind near the mutant HTT gene and just repress its transcription, reduce how much messenger RNA gets made from it.
And it can tell the difference between the good copy and the bad one.
Yes, and that's the key. Studies in mice have shown they can get a 40 to 60% reduction in the mutant mRNA without affecting the normal healthy allele.
Which brings us to the real cutting edge, CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing. How can CRISPR possibly tell the difference between two versions of the same gene to only silence the toxic one?
This is the revolutionary part. Allele-specific editing. We can do it by taking advantage of tiny, naturally occurring spelling differences in the DNA code.
Single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs.
Exactly. If one of those SNPs happens to be in or near a sequence called the PAM, which is like the address label that Cas9 needs to bind to the DNA,
I see.
then we can design the CRISPR system to recognize the PAM sequence only on the mutant chromosome. It completely ignores the healthy one.
So Cas9 can go in and precisely cut out and silence a huge chunk of the disease-causing gene while leaving the good functional gene completely untouched.
That's the goal. It's incredibly precise.
So let's pull back and look at the bigger picture. The knowledge from HD isn't just about HD. It connects to Alzheimer's, to Parkinson's.
It really does. What's so fascinating is this shared pathology of how the disease spreads. Even though the proteins that are clumping are different, it's Huntington and HD, alpha-synuclein and Parkinson's, tau and Alzheimer's, the way the toxicity spreads between brain cells appears to be the same.
It's a transcellular spread.
Right. Evidence shows these aggregates get released from one sick cell, they get taken up by a neighboring healthy cell through endocytosis, and then they basically burst out inside and spread the toxicity. It moves from neuron to neuron.
So what does this all mean? The story of HD combining these old-school methods like pedigree analysis with the speed and precision of something like CRISPR, it's really established the roadmap for how we have to tackle all of these complex neurogenetic disorders.
To just recap the whole thing, HD is caused by that poly-Q expansion, leading to a toxic gain-of-function protein. That protein then causes this widespread cellular chaos. It shuts down genes, jams up protein disposal, and starves neurons of energy.
And the path forward for therapy is clear.
It's defined. Either you silence the toxic gene with something like ASOs or CRISPR, or you find ways to mitigate the downstream damage that protein causes.
So that leaves us with a final thought for you to take away. Given that HD, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease all seem to use the exact same cellular transport pathway, exocytosis and endocytosis, to spread their toxic proteins between neurons, does this shared mechanism suggest that a single, broad therapy targeting only this specific cellular transport system could potentially slow the progression of all three of these devastating neurodegenerative diseases at the same time? That's a possibility worth exploring. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.